The Xal'Tar Dominion had fought wars before, conquered entire systems, reduced civilizations to dust. Their bioengineered warriors, cold and calculating, knew the exact limits of every enemy they had ever encountered. Until now, Commander Vas'Rok stood in the center of the warship Fury of the Stars, watching as holographic projections flickered around him. Blue Xal'Tar figures moved in perfect formations, executing their textbook. The human outpost Delta-47, a backwater military station on the edge of occupied space, was already surrounded. The battle would be over before the humans could even formulate a proper. Vas'Rok clicked his mandibles, satisfied. "Begin phase 2, he ordered. His second-in-command, strategist Liquid, activated a sequence on the control. Below them, in the gray wasteland of Delta-47, the first wave of Dominion forces. Armored sentinels, sleek and insectoid, moved with silent precision. The humans had been pinned inside their bunkers for hours. Fatigue should have been setting in by now. Their biochemistry dictated it. And yet, something felt wrong. Vas'Rok narrowed his eyes at the live battle feed. "Move, move, keep laying down fire." Ryan Carter slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, popped up from behind the reinforced barricade, and sent a burst of tungsten rounds into an advancing. The alien's sleek armor buckled under the kinetic impact, and it went down in a heap of twitching limbs. They just kept coming. Carter's muscles screamed, his eyes burned, and his throat was raw from barking. But stopping wasn't an option. He had no idea how long they'd been fighting. 30 hours? Maybe more. Didn't matter. He wasn't dead yet. A plasma bolt shrieked past his head, melting a chunk of the bunker wall behind. Carter hit the ground and rolled, cursing. He heard Private Vasquez, crouched next to him, laughing between ragged breaths. "We're still here, sir," she wheezed. "Crazy bastards just don't get it, do they?" Carter grinned despite himself. Blood smeared across his face. "Then we'll have to spell it out for them." Commander Vas'Rok felt his chitin tighten in irritation. The humans were still resisting. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how. Their patterns were erratic. They should have been collapsing by now. The Dominion had analyzed their species' endurance based on dozens of simulations. Human soldiers, like any biological organism, would inevitably their breaking point. And yet, Vas'Rok watched as a human warrior bleeding from multiple wounds, one arm barely attached, still managed to kill 3 Xal'Tar troopers before going down. The humans were supposed to retreat when outnumbered, but they weren't. They were digging in, snarling, fighting harder. "Strategist," Vas'Rok growled. "Explain." Liquid hesitated, scanning data reports. "Yes, sir. Their biochemical levels are off the charts," he stammered. "They should be experiencing crippling fatigue, neural shutdown, pain-induced." Vas'Rok's mandibles twitched. "And yet," Liquid swallowed. "And yet, they keep fighting." Carter yanked a combat knife from his thigh holster and slammed it into the soft spot between his Xal'Tar trooper's armor plates. The alien convulsed, shrieked, and collapsed. Blood thick and violet spattered across Carter's visor. "Shit," he muttered, ripping the knife free. He turned just in time to see Vasquez take a plasma hit to the leg, crumpling. No time to think. Carter hauled her up with one arm and kept moving. The ground shook. Explosions rippled across the battlefield. The Xal'Tar pushed harder. The Dominion was trying to end this quickly. "Fine." Carter clicked his comms. "This is Carter to all remaining units. No retreat. We hold the line." Across the outpost, dozens of battered, bloodied Marines locked eyes through. And then they laughed. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was broken, raw, unhinged, the sound of warriors who had passed the point of exhaustion and reached something far worse, the sheer refusal to quit. The Dominion expected humanity to break, but they had no idea what humans did when their backs were against the wall. Vas'Rok stared at the screen, something cold and alien slithering into his gut. For the first time in his military career, he felt doubt, Liquin's voice was thin. "Commander, the humans." Vas'Rok turned sharply. "Spit it out." The strategist exhaled shakily, his mandibles clicking with unease. They don't have an off switch." Silence. The holographic screen flickered, showing humans still fighting long past any reasonable endurance limit. Vas'Rok's claws tightened into fists. What kind of creatures had they just made enemies of? His mistake was assuming this was a war of attrition. He didn't realize it was a war of endurance. And humans never stop. They don't surrender. They don't break. And if you push them hard enough, they only fight harder. Xal'Tar High Command, Fury of the Stars. Vas'Rok's mandibles clicked in agitation as the latest battlefield reports streamed across the holographic war table. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The human defenders of Outpost Delta-47 had been pinned down for nearly 2. No food, no rest. By all rational measures, they should have collapsed into biological shutdown. And yet, his best warriors were dying in droves. The ground beneath the outpost was littered with Xal'Tar corpses, their sleep battle armor shattered, their bodies riddled with kinetic slugs. Their corpses lay alongside humans who had died on their feet. There was something unnatural about these creatures. No species fights past the point of biological exhaustion. No species keeps going after lethal injury. And yet, Carter's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Was it adrenaline? Exhaustion? Blood loss? Didn't matter. He ripped the empty magazine from his rifle, slammed in a new one, and threw himself against the barricade. They had been fighting for nearly 50 straight hours. His muscles felt like molten iron, his veins pumped battery acid, and his head was pounding so hard he could hear his own heartbeat over the gunfire. He risked a glance over the makeshift wall. More Xal'Tar, more bodies. The trench smelled like burnt flesh and ozone, mixed with a sharp copper bite. A plasma round sizzled past his ear, close enough that the heat made his skin. "Goddamn bugs just won't quit," Vasquez yelled from beside him, her voice hoarse from dehydration and combat stimulants. Carter gave a humorless grin, his teeth smeared with dirt and blood. "Neither do we." Liquin's trembling claws tapped at the control interface, analyzing heat signatures from the battlefield. His secondary eyelids flicked rapidly, a nervous tick. "Their combat performance is escalating, Commander," he said, voice barely. Vas'Rok turned, his slitted pupils narrowing. "Escalating?" Liquin's mandibles quivered. "It doesn't make sense. Their metabolic output is increasing, not decreasing. Their aggression levels are rising, instead of fatigue setting in. It's like..." He hesitated. Vas'Rok's voice darkened. "Like what?" The strategist swallowed. "Like they're getting stronger." A Xal'Tar warrior lunged at Carter, its segmented arms a blur. Too fast to react, the alien swiped at his chest, knocking the rifle from his hands and sending him crashing into the trench wall. Pain exploded across his ribs. The Xal'Tar raised a bladed forearm, ready to gut him. Carter grabbed its wrist mid-swing. A human shouldn't have had the strength to stop it. He was starving, dehydrated, bleeding. His muscles were running on sheer willpower. And yet, with a guttural roar, Carter ripped the alien's arm out of its socket. The Xal'Tar shrieked, violet blood spraying across the trench. Carter twisted the severed arm like a club, caved in the alien's head, then spat blood onto the corpse. He looked up. Vasquez stared. So did the other Marines, and so did the Xal'Tar troopers on the other side of the battlefield. Something broke in them. "Commander," Liquin whispered, "they just ripped one of our warriors apart with their bare hands." Vas'Rok said nothing. The battlefield feed showed dozens of humans still standing, despite broken bones, missing limbs, bullet wounds. And they were laughing. Not joyous laughter. Not victory. Something darker. It wasn't the laugh of soldiers winning a war. It was the laugh of warriors who no longer cared if they lived or died. Carter wiped Xal'Tar blood from his face, then reached into his vest, pulled out a single combat stim. He jammed the auto-injector into his thigh. His veins caught fire. His vision sharpened. His rage crystallized. He looked over his exhausted, battered Marines. Then he stood. "Fix bayonets," he roared. Metal clicked. Steel slid into place. On the other side of the battlefield, the Xal'Tar warriors stared in horror. The humans weren't stopping. They were advancing. Carter raised his blade. "Charge!" The horror unfolded in real time on Vas'Rok's display. Humans weren't supposed to do this. No species in the galaxy fights past the limit of physical exhaustion, let alone charges into battle on nothing but adrenaline and sheer hate. And yet, here they were, bleeding, laughing, killing. The Xal'Tar soldiers on the ground broke first. They turned. They ran. Some dropped their weapons entirely. They didn't just lose the battle. They lost their nerve. Vas'Rok stood frozen, his claws gripping the war table. No, this wasn't war. This was something else. And it terrified him. Commander Vas'Rok watched in silence. The battlefield had descended into madness. Humans didn't just refuse to die, they refused to stop. A full Xal'Tar battalion, numbering over 1,000 elite warriors, had been deployed to crush the ragged remnants of Outpost Delta-47. They should have overwhelmed the remaining humans easily. Instead, they were running. Vas'Rok's mandibles twitched, his talons digging into the war table. This wasn't war anymore. It was a slaughter, and his troops were the ones being slaughtered. Carter moved like a demon. His muscles were on fire. His lungs screamed for air. His body was begging for rest. Didn't matter. The bayonet in his hands dripped with alien blood. His rifle was empty. He had stopped counting his kills hours ago. The Xal'Tar ranks had broken. The once organized, disciplined warriors had collapsed into chaos. Some ran. Some froze, paralyzed in terror. Some dropped their weapons entirely. And the ones who still fought, Carter hunted them down. A Xal'Tar soldier lunged with a plasma blade. Carter sidestepped, jammed his bayonet into the alien's throat, and twisted. The alien gurgled and dropped. Another tried to fire from a distance. Carter grabbed a fallen rifle, snapped off a shot, and hit the warrior's center. The smoke-filled air carried the sounds of panicked alien screams. And something worse. The laughter. Not joy, not celebration. Something broken, something primal. The humans were laughing. Carter whirled, looking across the battlefield. His Marines, bruised, battered, and bleeding, were still fighting. Not because they expected to win, not because they thought they would survive, but because they didn't know how to stop. And the Xal'Tar knew it. The alien warriors, their entire species built on logic, efficiency, and calculated tactics, had never encountered an enemy like this. Their species fought wars to win. Humans fought wars to end them. Liquid was shaking. His secondary eyelids flickered rapidly as he stared at the data stream. "Commander," he whispered. "They're retreating." Vas'Rok's chest tightened. "What?" Liquid's claws trembled as he highlighted live battlefield footage. The Xal'Tar front lines had collapsed. The entire battalion was fleeing. Vas'Rok felt his throat dry out. "They're running," Liquid croaked. "His best warriors, his elite troops, fleeing from a handful of dying humans. This isn't possible," Vas'Rok muttered. "No army, no species should be able to sustain this level of combat for so long." Liquid swallowed hard. "These aren't warriors, sir," he whispered. "There's something else." Carter drove his boot into the chest of a fallen Xal'Tar, pinning the alien to. The creature shrieked, struggling against the weight. Carter knelt, gripping its throat. The Xal'Tar was terrified. Its large, multi-lensed eyes darted in panic. Carter's own eyes were bloodshot, hollow with exhaustion and something deeper. Something primitive. The alien gasped in its warbling tongue, pleading. Carter leaned in. He didn't even understand the words, but he understood fear. He let the alien go, not out of mercy, out of something worse. "Run," Carter whispered. The Xal'Tar scrambled to its feet and bolted. Carter watched it disappear into the smoke. Let it run. Let it spread the message. Let them know what they had awakened. Vas'Rok stood motionless. His elite forces were gone, either dead or retreating in disgrace. A silence had settled over the war room. It was Liquid who finally broke it. "Commander." Vas'Rok turned, his voice flat. "Speak." Liquid hesitated. "Then, this battle is lost." The words hit like a plasma round. The Xal'Tar Dominion had never abandoned a battle. But this was suicide. Vas'Rok's talons curled into a fist. "We withdraw," he muttered. Liquid exhaled, sagging with relief. Vas'Rok looked back at the screen one last time, at the battlefield of human monsters. Their bodies broken, their blood spilling into the dirt. And yet, they were still standing. He shivered. What had they just made enemies of? The Xal'Tar ships began leaving orbit. The humans didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They just stood there, watching the sky covered in blood. Carter swayed on his feet. He could feel the adrenaline wearing off, the pain creeping in. But there was one last thing to do. He pulled the comms mic to his mouth, flipping to an open frequency. The Xal'Tar could hear him. "Good." Carter took a breath, then whispered, "Run faster." Then the signal cut. Vas'Rok played the human's final transmission on repeat. The ragged voice, the barely contained hatred. "Run faster." He turned to Liquid. "New directive," he said. Liquid nodded. "All engagements with humanity are to be avoided at all costs." The Xal'Tar would never fight humans in direct combat again, because humans didn't fight wars to win. They fought wars to end them, and that made them monsters. Vas'Rok stared at the retreat path on the holographic war table. The remaining Xal'Tar forces were pulling back, scrambling onto drop ships, and abandoning the battlefield as quickly as their shaken, exhausted bodies could. And still it didn't feel like enough. He could feel it. A primal, suffocating dread that clung to the air of the war room like static. Retreating men escaping, but he wasn't sure they had truly escaped. Liquid hesitated, his claws twitching as he reviewed the last data feeds from CERT. He croaked, "They're not pursuing us." Vas'Rok exhaled slowly, feeling a momentary relief until Liquid's neck turned his blood cold. They don't have to. The humans didn't need to chase them down, because they had already won. Carter sank to his knees. His body was wrecked. Every muscle fiber burned like molten steel. His ribs felt cracked, and his uniform was so drenched in sweat, blood, and filth that it barely felt light. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He clenched them into fists, forcing control. Around him, the other Marines were just standing there, silent. No cheers, no celebration, no relief, just the numb weight of survival. They had fought for so long, burned through so much energy, so much pain, that their bodies didn't even know how to process the fact that it was over. Vasquez stumbled over, dropping next to him. She let out a breathless laugh, the hollow, post-battle kind. We made it." Carter swallowed, trying to find the words. But the truth was, he didn't feel like they'd won. He just felt empty, like something inside him had been burned away. The Xal'Tar fleets regrouped at a safe distance, their warships hovering in silent formation, battered and broken. Across the command network, warriors spoke in hushed tones, in fearful whispers. It was spreading. The realization, the new, horrifying knowledge that had taken root in their minds. Humans didn't fight like any species they had ever encountered. The Dominion had assumed war was a contest of strength, of firepower, But the humans, they fought with something else. Something that defied reason. Something that terrified even the most hardened Xal'Tar generals. They laughed. One of the survivors muttered, voice shaking. I saw one of them, half his face missing, still laughing. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even angry. The council chamber was silent. Vas'Rok listened to the whispers, listened to the fracturing morale of his people. And he knew, in that moment the damage was already done. Carter's radio crackled. A broadcast ping from the retreating Xal'Tar fleet. They were reaching out. Surrender. Negotiation. Didn't matter. Carter didn't care. He grabbed the radio, blood-streaked fingers gripping tight. He clicked the transmitter on, and he spoke. Run faster. That was all. Just 2 words. Then he cut the signal. Vasquez looked at him. Jesus, you think they'll come back? Carter shook his head. No, and he meant it. They wouldn't come back because they knew what would be waiting for them if they did. Vas'Rok listened to the human's final words. Over and over. The comm signal was brief, but it carried a weight unlike anything he had ever felt before. Run faster. A message. A warning. A goddamn promise. His claws clenched. This war, Vas'Rok said slowly, his voice rough, is over. Liquid nodded, and so, the Xal'Tar Dominion made its decision. From this day forward, all engagements with humanity were to be avoided. Not negotiated, not managed, avoided. Because if the Dominion ever pushed humans to the brink again, they knew exactly what would happen. The council chamber was silent. High-ranking Xal'Tar strategists sat in their ornate, high-backed seats. But no. The holographic projection of Outpost Delta-47 flickered above the center table. As one strategic battlefield, now nothing but a mass grave of both human and. The war should have ended differently. They should have crushed the humans, but they hadn't. Instead, they had fled. And the worst part? They were still running. Word traveled fast. Faster than any official communique. Faster than any classified report. Survivors from Delta-47, those who had barely escaped the nightmare, brought stories back to their homeworlds. And those stories spread like wildfire. Tales of soldiers who refused to die. Of humans who fought long after their bodies should have failed. Of warriors who didn't surrender, didn't retreat, and didn't stop not even when. At first, some Xal'Tar dismissed them as exaggerations. But then the battle recordings leaked. Hacked transmission feeds, helmet cam footage, first-person accounts of the horror. Entire fleets watched in silence as grainy, chaotic video played across there. A human soldier, his armor shattered, his body drenched in both his own blood and that of his enemies, laughing as he dragged a Xal'Tar warrior into the mud and killed him with his bare hands. Another, missing an arm, screaming in defiance, still charging forward. And then, the last transmission. Run faster. The 2 words that haunted the Dominion. Before Delta-47, the Xal'Tar had viewed humanity as just another species, intelligent, yes, but manageable. That belief was gone now. The new doctrine was clear. No more direct engagements. No more ground wars. If conflict with humanity was absolutely necessary, it would be fought for. Or not at all. Because no amount of technology or tactics could counter something so. The Xal'Tar weren't the only ones paying attention. Other spacefaring species, including some of humanity's allies, began studying. For years, human diplomats had painted themselves as reasonable, pragmatic, peaceful whenever possible. But now, the mask had slipped. Now, the galaxy knew the truth. Humans weren't warriors. They were apex predators. Predators who had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war. And once they sunk their teeth in, they never let go. Back in a classified military briefing room on Earth, Admiral Jacob Reinhardt reviewed the reports. He watched the footage from Delta-47, replaying the battle in slow motion. Carter's final transmission echoed through the room. Run faster. The Admiral exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Across the table, a younger officer shuffled nervously. Sir, the officer muttered, I know we won. But Reinhardt raised an eyebrow. But what? The officer hesitated. What if they don't come back? The Admiral's lips curled into something halfway between a smirk and a grimace. Oh, he said quietly. They'll be back. He tapped the classified reports in front of him. We just made them afraid, Reinhardt muttered. And nothing is more dangerous than an enemy that fears you. The officer swallowed hard. Because one day, someone's going to decide the only way to deal with a monster, the Admiral said, is to put it down first. The room fell silent. Because he was right. On the far edge of the galaxy, in the darkened control room of a warship, Xal'Tar officer played Carter's transmission one last time. He leaned forward, mandibles clicking in agitation. His subordinates watched him nervously. Finally, he spoke. "Send word to the Dominion." His voice was flat, expression unreadable. "We need a new strategy." A cold silence filled the room. Because retreating wasn't enough. Because humanity wasn't a species they could afford to ignore anymore. And because, if war ever came again, they would need to end it before it even began.